we are looking at a little bit of exploration, just a tiny bit of exploration around targeted universalism. And as Linda shared, some of this is coming from what does it mean to think about and to hold doing equity work, and knowing that when we say we're engaging in work to make things, our systems, our policies, our procedures more equitable for all, that systems of oppression have really asked us to hold an us versus them. And so sometimes when we hear we want to make things equitable, it feels like or can sound like somebody then is getting left out, right? Because doesn't that mean we have to focus only on one group or certain groups of folks? And so we're going to think about how targeted universalism can reshape our thinking on that. So by the time I finish, and it's short, I hope you'll have a bit of understanding on what targeted universalism is. Maybe begin to see some connections between targeted universalism and the work already happening at the library that you work at and in the community. Because my thought and my thinking is there is some thinking happening in your libraries around this topic already, maybe not with this title of targeted universalism. And then here she goes again, bringing us back to those darn 5Ds, right? How does targeted universalism and the 5Ds, how can they mush together? And they go together really beautifully, actually. So targeted universalism is a term that was coined by John A. Powell. And John Powell, he spells his name all in lowercase, so that's why you see it that way here. I'm honoring how he expresses his name. And he is at and leads, directs the Othering and Belonging Institute that is housed at UC Berkeley, and does some beautiful, beautiful work around what does it mean to create cultures of belonging and systems of belonging. In a teeny tiny nutshell, targeted universalism is a framework and can be built into frameworks that holds, we really want to think about things in terms of what's one goal, what's one big overarching theme or hope that we have for everyone in our community, knowing that different folks and different members of our community need different supports to reach this same overarching goal. So no one gets left behind, and it's not about filling in gaps. So what John A. Powell says is when we're thinking about filling in gaps, we're often thinking about those gaps in terms of one group of folks and then comparing other groups to this particular group and seeing, well, this group A has all of these amazing things, or they have these skills, or they're reaching these benchmarks, they're doing these things. And then groups B, C, and D aren't quite there yet. There's some gaps there. What John A. Powell says is even in that dominant group, in that main group that we look to, everyone's not having their needs met in that group either. And so what can we do to say, let's work to ensure that everyone has their needs met as we work to reach this goal, to advance some work that we're doing. Many folks refer to targeted universalism as equity 2.0. Not sure how I feel about that, but I wanted to put that in the space. So targeted universalism says, let's look at and do some exploration of what's happening, how our systems operating, how are our policies and procedures operating, and what do we see as a challenge, what maybe is a shared aspiration that we have that can help us get to a goal. So first we want to think about, what is this goal that we were hoping to attain? What are we hoping to work toward? What is a challenge that we're hoping to address? And your library can, the staff, the folks that you're working with can decide that. Maybe you decide that based on feedback from folks in the community, or based on data that you're seeing in your library. You're looking at survey responses and participation numbers, and you notice we're not getting the participation with this particular program that we're hoping to get. And so the goal is to have to name that we want to increase participation, and we want to do that across all of our communities. So what's the goal, that big overarching goal? And then targeted universalism says, okay, let's pull back and look at the big picture. What are the trends that we see? How are systems, policies, procedures impacting everyone in this community? How is it making it possible for some to reach this goal? How is it hindering others from reaching this goal? So we're starting to do some assessment. We're starting to learn what's working, what's not working, where challenges are, and why. And then we begin to identify the groups, how groups within community are showing up differently. So one of the examples that Powell uses is when he was called in to Portland, Oregon to do some work with housing. And at the time that he was called in to do this work, Portland had one of the lowest home ownership rates in the nation. And there were various groups who were coming together seeking to change that. And it started this huge rift. It created a rift in the community. It created these divides where folks were communities of color, and organizations that were working with communities of color were coming together saying, we need to do this and we need to do that. And white-bodied organizations, white-led organizations were saying, but then that leaves us out. And leaders in the work were getting frustrated. And Powell said, why don't we take this targeted universalism approach? And folks weren't, they weren't hopeful. And so Powell sat down with leaders from different organizations and said, well, what really is the goal? And they said, the goal is to increase homeownership across the board in the city of Portland. So then they went to this assessment piece and they said, well, what are the barriers that are in place that are preventing people from owning homes? And they start identifying groups. And what they noticed is that even in white spaces, if the goal was 100% or 100% home ownership, that 90% of white folks were homeowners, but only 65% of Indigenous First Nations folks. And so there needed to be a different approach to get the white folks up to that 100%. We needed to make a 10% jump, right? But for our First Nations and Indigenous folks, we needed to make a 35% jump. So what are those different strategies? So in identifying the groups, we're looking at who is accessing our programming? How are they able to access it? But how is that showing up differently for each group? We need to understand what the barriers are for each group so that we know how to speak to those barriers. It's not a one size fits all, right? So then we start to do some assessing and understanding of what it might take for each community and each group to reach that goal. So we start to maybe do some work within the community, some listening sessions, some surveys, some exploring with our colleagues, reaching out to folks who are also doing similar work in the community to really learn, how do we get each community, each member, each group in our community to get closer to reaching this goal. And then we want to develop strategies to support each community. So that might mean, well, we know with our English language learning community, it means that we really need to have interpretation available at some of our programming. We might need to have translated materials. For others, it might mean we need to do some work going out into that community and then bringing them in to us slowly. For some groups, it might mean they have a really high participation rate, but we know we're not reaching everyone in that particular group. How are we maintaining the relationships we already have? Because we don't want to let any groups fall by the wayside. Equity says we need to make sure everyone is included, right? And so maybe with one group, it's we need to maintain relationship and do new things to make sure that we're bringing in folks in this same group who don't see themselves represented. And it could be for a variety of reasons. What are those reasons? What are the strategies we need to reach them? Using a targeted universalism approach allows us to set a shared goal, one shared goal, and then create targeted approaches that help us reach each different group or community to reach this goal. And it's kind of, it can be a scaffolded approach. We might realize that, wow, all of our communities need support, this particular support, but how we bring it to each community might look or sound different. So targeted universalism allows us to have one shared goal for all of our communities. We don't have to come up with 5 different goals and 5 different plans of working to those 5 different goals. We come up with one goal and then targeted approaches for the communities that we want to see meet that goal. And then we do the work of helping those communities get to reaching that goal. We're doing a lot of that support work. Targeted universalism allows us to seek authentic ways to engage with communities because we need to reach out to them to learn, okay, this is what data is telling me. Will the community support what data is telling me around what some of those barriers are, what communities need, what supports do they need? What does that look like and sound like and feel like in those communities to help us get to this goal? What supports can I provide as a leader in the community? What connections can we make? But it allows us to really engage with our communities in some real authentic, meaningful ways. One of the beautiful things about targeted universalism is it helps to create a sense of belonging. So folks in the community begin to see themselves as full-fledged members and valuable members in the library community, right? And it starts to decrease us and them thinking because it's all about we're all working to get to the same place. So it's really about solidarity and working in solidarity. And we can't do that with them mentality. Solidarity asks us to think about us, right? And to hold the us. And targeted universalism does the same thing. How are we creating bridges so that everyone can move forward and get to this goal versus an us them kind of mentality or narrative?